So just jumping in here to say that I had to cut the video in half to make a bonus video because that was a lot of questions that came in. So yeah, it's gonna be a bit split up. I don't know how. It's all up to future Ellie, but yeah, more questions, more answers. There's a high chance that the plug that my laptop is connected to is gonna both make noise and movement against the tripod. You have been warned. But anyway, first question that I found that I haven't replied to yet is I'm just gonna read it. I'm gonna keep people anonymized because I haven't asked everyone if they want to be on here, so bear with me. But anyway, I might get the opportunity to visit Edinburgh this summer. What are the yarn shops and also knitwear shops, if you know any, that I shouldn't miss? Now, first of all, for these kinds of questions, if you want a prompt response from me, you'd probably be better off just Googling this kind of thing. If you Google yarn shop Edinburgh, you are going to find the shops that I am now going to mention. So apologies, I'm not going to be telling you anything new. But I am going to tell you the ones I like anyway, based on Google search and what I remember from having been there. First one coming up is Macquarie Brothers, which is a nice shop for commercial yarn. You will find Rowan yarns, you will find Regia yarns, you'll find some Shetland yarns like Jameson and Smith. It's a chain that you will find in the northern UK in a number of cities, and it's nice and good. But there are more yarn shops tailored to our online community. One is Ginger Twist Studio, which is actually the studio of a hand dyer in Edinburgh. It is a very, very small shop, but I think it's worth going and is squishing all the yarn. It is really lovely. I didn't get to go last time I was in Edinburgh, but I went the first time around because my Airbnb was right close. But right in the middle of these two shops is Kathy's Knits, and this is my personal favorite, I think. There's another favorite of mine as well, which I will be mentioning in a bit, but Kathy's Knits is lovely. It has the kind of yarn focus you would expect in Scotland, but also you know, it's up to date with things. You will also find hand-dyed yarns, you will find, you know, more commercial yarns like West Yorkshire Spinners and Jameson Smith. You'll find a lot of JC Rennie, which I find very exciting. There's a lot of the latest publications in knitting, and it's an awesome shop. I always feel very welcome there. I think Kathy's lovely and it's good. The only problem is you may struggle to find it as you walk because it's sort of on the lower ground floor. I still think it's fairly clear. You're gonna see it. I didn't miss it when I hadn't been there before, but yeah. And then you have Be Inspired Fibers, which is a new favorite of mine because I didn't go my previous times in Edinburgh, but last time I did. And it's great. It has a lot of variety in yarns. It covers a lot of different needs, anything from affordable commercial to high-end luxury. The pure wools, a Holst yarn, I think there was some North Ronaldsy there. It's really covering a broad range of yarn, and again, and up to speed with the current you know, Knittosphere online. Knows what's going on. Really lovely lady doing having the shop, and I really liked it. I would definitely go back there. It is a bit of a trek from the other three yarn shops, but do make sure you have time to go there. They tend to have different closing hours during Edinburgh Yarn Festival, but in general you just need to pay attention to the usual closing times and just make sure you get there, and you can get there by bus, so do check it out. Ooh, and here's a question I really like. Ellie, a non-yarn question that arises from my language and literature studies. When you write in Norwegian, do you use bokmål or nynorsk? If the former, what are your thoughts about nynorsk in general? I'm gonna have a drink now because this is gonna take me a while. So I realize I'm gonna have to give a bit of a backstory here for those who are not familiar with either. So Norway, you know, little country up in the north, that's the name. It's got two written forms of language, and the simple story behind how that came to be in such a small country with just 5 million people is that we have been under Danish and or Swedish rule for a long time. The vast majority of time, basically since I think medieval ages, Norway was under Danish rule, and it was sometimes under Swedish rule, but primarily under Danish. So Danish was seen as, you know, the road to culture. You know, Germany was the big hub of high culture, of what was up and coming in science and literature and art, and Danish was, you know, the next kind of the mediator between the rural poor Norway and the great culture of Germany. So if you spoke Danish, you were a bit closer to that, you spoke a bit finer. And I actually kind of find I have that feeling in me still today. If someone writes me in Danish, I am always a bit like, oh, you speak so posh. I know they're not, but it's kind of the role that Danish took in Norway. It was the way to speak and write, which has greatly influenced, you know, how people talk in Oslo to this date. And so we didn't really have a written form of Norwegian, we had Danish. And Danish is close enough to Norwegian that it works. But when Norway was separated from both Denmark and Sweden eventually, there was a great drive to get our own independent written language. And there was a lot of political debate as to which language that should be, because Norway has a huge variety of dialects. It spans from, you know, the furthest point in south to north, and anything in between. Is such variety, and you can date that back to the Black Plague, because it knocked down, I think, the population by 1/3 or something, and every little village and town became so isolated that they just developed these separate dialects that were very, very different. As if they weren't different enough before, they certainly were now. And I speak one of those dialects that are very it's something. It's very distinct from any other place in Norway. You could pinpoint where I'm from pretty easily from how I talk. There wouldn't be much doubt. And often people from regions further apart in Norway may struggle to understand me, and people from Sweden and Denmark will often struggle to understand me and my dialect, because it's not something they will be often exposed to. If they are exposed to Norwegian media, it's often media from Oslo, where they speak a lot different and in a way that's closer to Swedish and Danish. So you have all these dialects, and that was where that political debate came from in the 1800s, I think. And some more conservative forces said what we should do is just take Danish and keep Danish, or change Danish to be a bit more like how we speak in Norway. And how we speak in Norway is just the Norwegianized Danish. So it's kind of, you know, Oslo Norwegian. And the other camp said, no, we need to look at what's Norwegian, what's true, and what did people speak before this Danish meddling. And we need to look to southern and western Norway, because that is the closest we will find to Old Norse, which is kind of true. It is the closest we do find to Old Norse, and it's the most similar kind of Norwegian to Icelandic, which is closer to Old Norse again. And so to find the roots of Norwegian, they explored, I say they, Ivar Aasen is a guy who basically traveled to collect the language, but he primarily only traveled to collect the language from southern and western Norway, and created what was then called landsmål, so country tongue, I guess, what is now known as nynorsk, meaning New Norwegian. And Danish became riksmål, which means also country tongue, but in a more of the kingdom kind of way rather than the country kind of way. It's really a way to translate these words. And it's now known as bokmål, which means kind of book tongue, or book form, how you write books, I suppose. So that is kind of where those came from. And what is interesting is that nynorsk was supposed to be, you know, the more innovative and adaptive language that was based on how people actually talk. But it has more become a language that is a little bit more set in stone and a bit more fixed. It is still a language that adapts, but I find it seems harder to adapt to how people talk now, more so than bokmål. But also it's a bit unfair, because it's often presented in that way when actually there are more kind of liberal ways of using the language that people aren't often aware of. Now, me, myself, I am stuck somewhere in between, because I am from Middle Norway, so I'm from just above these two regions of Eastern Norway, Team Bokmål, and Western Southern Norway, Team Nynorsk, and none of them has taken into account how people like me talk. Some would argue that it's grammatically more similar to nynorsk because of how we end some words and bend them, as we say. But others would argue, and I probably agree, that it's closer to bokmål because of the actual words we use. A lot of the words we use are completely unique to our language, our dialect, but a lot of the time I find they are similar or closer to bokmål, the more Oslo-based way of writing. And that is the most common and most widespread way of writing Norwegian. So I often feel like neither of them represent me that well, but it's fine. I am okay with both. I like that both of them exist. And find often that the political debates of whether we should keep nynorsk in schools or not is a bit tedious, because I don't even know where I stand. I think they're both important. I think if you have one as your primary way of writing, you should at least have you know, some years to cover the other way. But it depends on your teacher. I think we should have teachers that are good at teaching it. I started off for 3 years having a teacher who was not very good at teaching nynorsk, and you know, here I have been living for 13 years not knowing how to write it. It didn't exist to me until then. And then I'm being introduced to it by someone who doesn't really know it. And then for just 1 year in upper secondary school, I had a teacher teaching me it, and just in 1 year managed to teach it to the entire class in such an efficient and precise way that I really came to appreciate it. And I'm quite happy to find a book that is written in nynorsk rather than bokmål. It fits with the literature, like, you know, a good fantasy book using nynorsk. It's pretty nice. I think I'm going to cut my answer short there. I have a lot of thoughts and feelings about it, but I'm not in any particular camp. I think both languages have adapted to how we talk today. Both a little bit different to how I talk, and a lot of other people talk as well. There's a little bit of conservative spelling for both of them. So, I mean, whatever way you write, it's alright. But I think for those of you not Norwegian, you'll probably primarily come across bokmål. It is the one that's used for the most part. I don't know if that answered the question. I use bokmål, and these were my thoughts. So here's another question. It's a bit long. I'm going to try to read it quickly. Hi Ellie, I just watched the 1 week sweater episode where you briefly mentioned how you do decreases/increases in 2 rows on the back of your yoke garments to adjust the fit. I tried to look at your projects, but I didn't seem to have any notes. You didn't seem to have any notes in there. I'm making a yoke pullover. Do you have any tips on how I could do this? How many times? How close together, etc.? I don't. That's the thing. Every time I just wing it. I tend to knit my garments top down, and I just kind of go, ooh, I'm feeling some potentialness for bagginess in the back. I may want to decrease some. So I tend to put 2 points that will be roughly in the center of my back, so the equivalent of where I would not exactly have my nipples, but similar to the back. That's a terrible comparison. I'm sorry if you're now all imagining nipples on the back. But yeah, roughly same area. It's not precise science, and I tend to just then figure out how often to decrease. Sometimes I decide I want to have a symmetrical decrease on each side of this kind of point, you know, where I put the stitch marker, or I might just do one on each side and kind of have them come towards each other that way rather than that way. Does that make sense? In terms of knowing for sure if it will fit you, there is a nice way to do it. You measure yourself. So let's say I measure around here, and let's say I'm 90 centimeters, okay? And I'm knitting a stitch gauge of 24 stitches per 10 centimeters or 4 inches. So I know what I need to get something that has 0 ease. I basically then have to, I get my calculator, I take 90, because I'm 90 centimeter, just making up numbers here, times, because you have a 24 stitch gauge, that divided onto 10, so per centimeter is 2.4. So we just go 90 times 2.4, and we get 216. So I need 216 stitches to make 90 centimeters. So maybe I was at 105 centimeter here, so that by the same token, 105 times 2.4 is 252. So I need the difference between 252 and 216. So that's, I would just subtract 216. 36, I need to reduce by 36 stitches, assuming I want to reach 90 centimeter. Maybe I want some positive ease, you know, then it's less. I need to distribute those. So what's that divided onto 4? 9. Okay, so I need to have 9 decrease rows, maybe, if I choose to do it that way. So I will be decreasing up under here, and the equivalent of the back here and here. But I could also take 36 and divide it onto 8 to have a more steep decrease. That's 4.5, so it gets a little bit more tricky. I guess what I would just do then is to decrease, so 2 places under the arm, so that's an issue together and an SSK. Do the same thing on the points in the back. But for the last round of decreases, maybe omit the ones in the back and just do under here. That should give you the same number, I think, just off the top of my head. So it's not a precise science. I can't tell you exactly how frequent, you know, how many rows. You just have to do maths, measure your row gauge, kind of following the same principle to see how many rows you are between this point and the point where you are 90 centimeter rather than 105, for instance. Again, making up measurements here. I hope that made sense. There is, you know, probably more in-depth nitty tech blog posts and stuff about this kind of thing. It's, you know, the principles that designers work from when making different sizes. I've been doing this a lot when I make spreadsheets and stuff over, you know, size grading for my designs. It gets a lot more complicated than what I covered right now. So if this seems complicated, oh boy, you're in for a treat. I'm just going to read the essential part of the question. A while back I remember I saw an episode where Ellie was talking about where to shop for yarn in Norway. Does anyone know which episode this was? A friend of mine travels to Norway this summer and wants to know. I don't remember. I tend to name my videos with, you know, relevant names. I know I was there in, you know, September, October, so somewhere around that. But what I do remember is that I made a yarn map. I'm gonna make a note now. I'm gonna link the yarn map because the yarn map will show you yarn shops in Oslo, Bergen, Trondheim, Vancouver, New York, London, what have you, the cities that I know of. So that will be your answer to that. But briefly, I mean, this person asked specifically about Oslo and Bergen. I mean, Bergen has a great yarn shop already at the train station, so you're sorted already. But you could also go to Husfriden, which is my #1 stop in any Norwegian city. And there are other shops. You'll find it on the map. In Oslo, there's also Husfriden, which is even bigger and better. But it's like in a shopping center called Glassmagasinet, which is kind of for things made out of glass and things for tourists. It's a bit odd. And you can't immediately see the yarn shop because you have to go down the escalator and then it will appear. I put a little video in the Oslo video so you can see it there, but it's also on the map and it's great. And there's also Pickles, there's Verbit. Oh, there's so many good yarn shops in Oslo. I'm sure I forgot some, but it's one of my favorite places to shop for yarn, so I hope you enjoy. There's also a person who has given a good long list of yarn shops in Oslo in the questions and answers thread, so do check that out if you haven't already. So here's another question, more to do with my patterns. Do you include written instructions in your colorwork patterns or just charts? I only include written instructions in my only color pattern I've written so far, but that's because I have no idea how to make charts. But I know most people do love their charts and little pictures or something. There are barely any written things. I have a lot of opinions about this and hopefully nobody will take offense, but I will say always, 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 always have charts for color work. Never write out color work in written. I know in cables and in lace and texture, we do this all the time. We write it and we offer charts as a side. Color work is different. Color work needs charts. It's a primarily visual thing. It's probably why it appeals to my visual brain so much, because I'm not a very verbal person, although I could go either way with a texture pattern, you know, lace, cable, what have you. But it's not common to offer written color work instructions, you know, saying knit 1 black, knit 3 white, knit 3 black, you know, you just don't. And I think if you knit a number of color work patterns, you will probably just see why. It's harder actually, even if you are a primarily verbal person, it's harder to process that because what you're making is an image. but I do have accompanying written instructions, so I will never have just the chart. While I myself personally am happy to knit just from a chart and will find that easier, or at least just as easy, that's kind of my specialty even in my patterns, that where a traditional Norwegian pattern would really just give you the chart, I always add written instructions. I will have a written text that gives you row by row instructions. So row 1 in the chart, knit this amount of stitches, do the same for these amount of rows. Maybe in row 5 something else happens, you're gonna make a stitch on column 13. It will show in the chart, but I will also write that. But I will never write out the actual colorwork pattern. I hope that made sense. That is just something that people don't do. But I do think it's good practice to write accompanying text to describe the other things that are happening in the chart, if you're increasing or decreasing or something like that. But in general, if you have just a chart, it's the same stitch count, beginning and end, there's nothing happening other than color work, you can say knit from chart for this number of stitches and this many repeats, and you know. Hope that was a good enough answer. I haven't planned any of this stuff. And I got someone asking about writing out patterns for the sock heels. Now I technically answered that question in the last episode, but no, my sock heel is part of my sock pattern, so you will have to get that pattern to get that heel. I will not be writing just vanilla sock patterns for the time being, because I'm still figuring out my vanilla socks. That's not my forte. I do colorwork socks, so that is why I feel confident in that I can say I am knowledgeable enough to publish patterns in. So you will have to get the relevant sock pattern to get that particular heel. And now begins questions asked specifically for when I said I would do a Q&A episode. So, how many hours per day do you spend knitting? Do you have a preferred daytime to knit or any knitting rituals? Good question. I knit more than I should be, and I know that. I have had a rough mental health year, and I have a brain that gets very fond of knitting, shall we say. And so that's the first thing I do in the morning. I usually had like a ritual where I would start waking up in the morning and go for a walk. Now I'm just like, well, that is precious, precious knitting time. And it's been kind of escalating more as I have become a designer. So I'm kind of juggling full-time PhD and part-time designer. There's not much hours in the day. So I kind of have to spend every hour of the day knitting, and I also enjoy it. So I wake up and I pick up my knitting, and then I'm like, I think my flatmates are ready in the bathrooms and kitchen because they have to go to actual work. Then I will, you know, do the thing to get ready in the morning. And we have enjoyed with my neighbour's dog again. Lovely. It's been a while. So I just knit a few rows, start with some podcast and something like that, and then get ready for the day, have my breakfast and a coffee, knit some more, and then get around to do, you know, PhDing stuff. But if I need a break, I'll pick up my knitting again. If I'm going elsewhere and I'm not just walking, I will knit during my commute. I will knit if I'm sat down with friends. I tend to even pick up my knitting if I'm having a meal, because if I'm having a meal, I tend to put on something to watch or listen to, and that may continue beyond the meal, so I will keep knitting. It's a little bit naughty. You get a bit of a prolonged lunch hour there. But I don't have particular rituals. I just sneak in knitting whenever I can because I enjoy it and I have a lot of stuff to finish. So it's not the best answer, but in general the answer is when I'm sitting, I'm knitting, and knitting gets me up in the morning. And it usually doesn't keep me up sitting too late, because I know I can knit the next day. So I had this question about steeks, and I think this person is asking if there is a golden rule, and saying if, you know, they need to make a bigger steek if you have bigger bust measurements to make more room. That is how I interpret this question. There's a lot of words and I'm trying to condense it a little bit. I think, and I'm saying this in the nicest possible way, I think you have misunderstood what steeks are, and I'm gonna just pick up my cardigan design for this to just show you what I mean. So this is the steek. I was knitting this flat, and then I decided I just don't want to, so I added 7 stitches here. I purl the first and the last, and the mid 5 are knitted. So there is that, and this will be cut right through the middle. I might do some reinforcing here, be it sewing or crochet, which side comment doesn't reinforce as such, it just kind of stabilizes. The reinforcement is in the yarn, if this yarn is that kind of yarn. We've yet to see that. If it's not, I will be sewing. The steek does not add anything to your size. This could have been a 1-stitch steek or a 20-stitch steek. It will not change the size of the garment or any area of the garment. Oh, hello helicopter, how nice of you to join us. Do you have anything to say about steeks, do you? So I think for this person asking this question, you may need to rethink what steeks are, kind of start from the beginning again, because it doesn't change anything. I will literally be removing all of this. I will cut in half and each section will be folded in, so it won't make any difference. That's why I'm doing this in a design that doesn't call for it, because it will make absolutely no difference to the size. So if you have a bigger bust, you will need to increase in the actual garment piece. If you add a bunch of stitches to the steek, you cut that in half, you're not going to benefit from that whatsoever. So let's go to another question. Someone's asking me if I can recommend some knitting podcasts in Norwegian, and also maybe some first learning steps of like Norwegian children's TV series or something. I don't know about TV series that much, but I can recommend one great Norwegian knitting podcast, and that is Strikketerapi. They are brilliant and wonderful people, and they, almost as a matter of principle, always only podcast in Norwegian, because that is something we need as well. We can't always speak English. We need to kind of, you know, represent, and they do that. So definitely check out Strikketerapi, my absolute favorite Norwegian knitting podcast on video. As for audio, you may want to check out Marte or Marte. They don't podcast as frequently now as they did, although they weren't super frequent ever, but they're brilliant. I love listening to them. Now one of the Martas has several kids and the other one had just had one, I think, if not soon. So it might be a while until you get another episode, but there's a back catalogue there for you to check out, and I really love that podcast. So another question. Hi Ellie, I see all your amazing projects and hear you talk about Norwegian knitting heritage a lot, but I am wondering how much of that translates to Scandinavian in general, and how much is specific to Norway. I have a fair bit of Danish heritage, not that my family knows much about it unfortunately, and would love to knit my cousin and her mom some Danish mittens using your Selby pattern, but I don't know if it would be totally off base with that or not. So that's the gist of the question anyway. I do know for certain that the stuff that I refer to as Norwegian knitting is Norwegian knitting, and it's very specific and kind of has been sitting on a little island of its own, so to speak. So they are very similar, and I don't really expect someone from outside of Scandinavia to maybe recognize the difference, but I often catch the gist of it very easily. I think a very good example is actually from one of my stitch dictionaries, so let's look at that. So here are some books that could help us answer this question. I'm a bit flustered now. You have no idea how much I had to jump and crawl all over my room to adjust a couple of things. This is a cute little booklet full of Swedish charts. So they're pretty much all based on Gotland patterns and also other related patterns. So here's a very good example. Another one. Another one, and so forth. I think you get the idea. I don't want to give away too much of this lovely little thing, but this is from Gotland. It's completely opposite end of Sweden to where it is relative to Norway, and yes, it's similar. You will see some things that are similar but arranged differently, and this is kind of more classic Swedish, I think. Short, simple pattern repeats. Kind of gets a bit closer to Latvian mitten knitting, which is also using that, but even more intricate, tighter knit, using more colors. Whereas this is more, you know, Scandinavian, where it's just using 2 colors, but you still get that repeatable pattern. That is the very typical sign of Swedish color work. And I think Alice Starmore nailed this. But if you just open on the page of each separate language, you kind of just get the idea. So Sweden is more pattern repeats, it's more geometrical but also more floral. It's kind of cute. You can sort of see how it's been reused in vintage. Whereas for Norwegian, it's a little bit harder, more squared. It's also geometrical, but it's all about the lines and the Norwegian star, for instance. You will see that comes up. Yeah, I can't really show you too much, but it's a very good idea to just open up this book and it just stares you in the face, the differences between them. They are interlinked and related and inform each other, but they are different, and I do get the difference from them the same way I get from like their folk music. You know, Swedish and Norwegian folk music are different but very similar, and often the case I just pick it up from a feeling rather than knowing the difference. I wanted to show you this book as well by Sheila McGregor. It doesn't segregate the different regions the way the other book does by Alice Darmore, but it gives you an idea. And sadly, none of them say much about Danish knitting, and I don't really know much about Danish colorwork knitting and traditional knitting either. I just know that Norwegian knitting is kind of its own thing, but not without influence from other neighboring countries. You will see, you know, the trading routes of that sea has, you know, you see the similarities in knitting patterns. You can often see how Shetland knitting and Norwegian knitting are so similar, but the use of colours is actually what sets them apart, and a few other things. So that's a very broad answer to your question. I don't know much, like I said, about Danish knitting, but when I say Norwegian knitting, I usually do that knowingly that this is a very specific Norwegian thing. Now, you were asking about Serbe mittens, and that is a thing I know for sure is Norwegian because it comes from a very specific village that is just an hour drive away from where I'm from. And again, not without influence from other places, but still its own thing that comes from that particular place. And there's another question. Hey Ellie, I just watched your latest podcast episode and you talk a bit about teaching in Greece. I would love to know more about how you went about preparing to teach. Are there any good resources on how to teach in classes? I'm wanting to start teaching hopefully next year, but I don't even know where I would begin. So any advice about that, or even just a look into your process, would be amazing in a podcast episode. Ooh, tricky question. I find this quite difficult to answer myself because I'm still figuring it out. I am very lucky to have teaching experience from university, because as a PhD student they often ask you to teach, and sadly you don't get any training. They just throw you into it and hope that you do your best, and I kind of have, and I've, you know, gotten good feedback and bad feedback, so I know what's good and I know what's bad, and that helps me. But in general, I am still figuring it out, and I am sad to say I haven't found any good resources on teaching knitting classes either. I don't know if you asked about knitting specifically, you just kind of said teaching. I'm sure there are classes to teach, but to teach knitting, I don't know. And I have come to realize there are a lot of different teaching styles. There are more workshop type things, which is usually what I do. I don't spend many minutes before I say, let's cast on, because you came here to knit, right? But others take a more lecture type of approach where they talk more than people get to knit, so they'll have to sit and listen. I tend to do the talking kind of as we knit, because often you are just knitting through a portion that's kind of samey. And that's when I can drop my fun facts and that kind of thing. As for preparing, oh, this goes far back. I actually made my Serbe mitten pattern as preparing for a class. That's what that pattern is. It's probably why it's also such an easy to follow pattern that people have found that they can follow even without my help there, because it was made to be for a class. So it holds all the instructions in itself, which, you know, a pattern should do. So this time I just picked up that pattern again, and I read through, and I kind of, you know, realized the stuff I want to cover, what order I want to do it, and kind of try to have it more memorized than in a note. But I'm thinking that might change. It might be easier if I have a structure in front of me, if anything, just to give the impression that I have a format, even though I already do. Often when I present it as though it's not that rigid, people assume I don't have a structure and they can just go blah. But I do, but I like to adapt it to the people that are there. So like the classes I had in Greece were very different. The first one I talked more, I was kind of directing the class more, whereas the other one people seem happy to take it in a more laid-back fashion. So for me, as long as people take away the things that I have to say in the class, what I want them to learn. I'm happy with that. So sorry if this is a bit of an unsatisfactory answer. I wish I had a better one, and I'm, like I said, still figuring it out, but I think it depends on how you want to teach and how you want to do it. If you want to take a more lecture type approach, or if you want to have a more workshop type approach. And I'm also thinking a lot about the personality types that teach, because there are some people you see more as an authority, and I'm not one of those people. I am younger than most people taking part in the class, and I even look younger than my age, apparently. A bit of a baby face. I don't reek authority. I have a very humble personality. I come across as kind of timid, so I'm trying to make that work in the class setting by, you know, kind of being direct and saying, you know, this is what we're gonna do, this is what I'm doing. If you want to look at what I'm doing now, you know, people respond differently to it. I have so many thoughts about this, but I think we need to just go on to the next question, and I'm a little bit hungry. So I just got a question from someone who is thinking about making a podcast, and I might just save this question for when I'm doing a more dedicated how to podcast episode, which I have thought about doing, just not anytime soon. Well, actually maybe soon, but not now, not right now. But I'm gonna try to answer just some things, some parts of the question, just because, why not? How much effort and time do I need to commit to a podcast, e.g. once a month? If you do once a month, the episode itself, I would estimate about 10 hours. So to give you an idea, I probably take 1 hour of getting ready. That includes me putting on my makeup and clothes and wash myself and all that stuff, but also tidying up my background if need be, setting up my camera, my lights, show note writing. I just write the list of very quick notes that you see under the video, and that's what I read from as well. So show notes and show outline is the same for me, so that's very efficient. Yeah, the whole thing can take an hour, and recording can take an hour or maybe 2, but then maybe it doesn't take an hour to prepare, so it all comes to about 3 hours of actually making the thing. And then you have maybe another 3 hours to edit, and then another 3 hours to export, and then now we're up to 9 hours, and then another hour to upload. So it's a 10-hour job. So if you do 1 episode a month, you will be looking at 10 hours a month, but that's just the beginning, because once you put your episode out there, the more social aspect of it starts, and that is the biggest time suck for me. Those 10 hours are nothing compared to having to be there for those that have questions, want to just contact you, even stuff that I don't think is reasonable to ask of me. It's sometimes when you share so much, people feel like they're entitled to a lot, and you have to spend time on that, or you should maybe not spend time on that. Lots of thoughts I have about that I may touch more upon in that more dedicated episode to making a podcast. If you have any questions related to that, by all means ask, because it's something I think about quite a bit. But it's a big time suck after you've actually put up the video, just so that you are prepared. And that was the thing I probably myself was not prepared for. So there were more questions from this person, but I will be saving this for a more dedicated episode, which I'm sure is why she asked these things. So the next question is, hi Ellie, I really enjoy your podcast. You've got me hooked on stranded colorwork, and you've helped me find a love for toothier yarns that I'm sure I wouldn't have discovered otherwise. So thank you for that. I've always wondered what you're doing your PhD in. If you'd be willing to share that information. By the way, your trip to Greece looked amazing, and you looked so happy in the clips. Well, thank you. Hey boy, I have to talk about my PhD. And I am really glad this person asked this question, although sometimes in real life I wish, you know those pins that say baby on board? I wish they kind of make one that says don't ask me when I finish my PhD. Just don't. We don't not ask each other that in the PhD group. It's just something we do not. But I am glad you asked this question, because I don't know, it's just funny that I haven't talked about it here, so I'm going to. So I researched something called delay discounting, or temporal discounting, or time discounting. It has a lot of names. It falls under the research area of decision-making psychology, or judgment and decision-making, which falls under cognitive psychology, which, you know, is in the more academic side of psychology. So a lot of times I say I'm doing a PhD in psychology, I'm going to be a doctor in psychology, people can't help thinking that I'm becoming a clinician, and I am not at all, and I cannot diagnose your funny brother or crazy mother, I'm sorry. So delay discounting is kind of like the adult version of the marshmallow test. So if you're not familiar with the marshmallow test, it's like when you have a kid and you say, so I'm going to put this marshmallow in front of you, and if when I come back you haven't eaten that marshmallow, you can have two. And this has been in the media a lot lately, because they found that actually while your performance as a child on that can predict your life outcomes, it does seem that if you have had a very cushy life, you know, you perform better, because you know you can always get another marshmallow later. You've come to familiar yourself with the kind of privilege you're born in, and whereas a child that doesn't get many marshmallows so much else will be like, I want that marshmallow now because I'm never gonna get one again. You know, it's where you're coming from plays in. It's not just that if you can't control yourself with marshmallows, you're going to be a terrible person. It's not really how it works. But anyway, I do the adult version with the hypothetical amounts of money. So it's like asking a person, you know, do you want £50 in a month or £70 in 3 months? Or, you know, you can vary the amounts, you can vary the delays. I'm just making up numbers here. But by varying all of these things, you just get this tipping point. Like, this is as much waiting time this person can tolerate before they won't wait, and they will have the smaller sooner than the larger later. This is how much of a monetary difference you need before someone says, that is not big enough for me to wait for, I will have the smaller sooner, you know? So we're looking into a lot of ways to make people wait, because waiting in this task, even though we're talking about hypothetical money, it, you know, is a metaphor for health, for savings, you know, pension savings. People are becoming kind of bad at saving for the pensions nowadays, and policies are making it more up to individuals, and individuals will often rather spend their money here and now. So what we try to find out is if we can get people to engage in more vivid thinking about the future, maybe they will wait more. And there's been some researchers before us that have found this. They have looked into episodic future thinking, which is the idea that our episodic memory, the memory of when we were in that place and did that thing, is actually not there to be, you know, oh, let me think about that time I was in Paris, you know. Instead, it's like for thinking about the future, because thinking about the past is useless, evolutionary speaking. Thinking about the future, however, is all about, you know, directing your behavior in an adaptive way. And so that is the idea that that's what our episodic memory is for. And so we try to think, if you can get people to think about this amount of money in that way, will you then wait? Because some people have found that earlier. And yes, that does seem to be the case. And similarly, there's also been some that have found that if you are told, instead of you will get that amount of money in 3 months, it's like asking someone, you will get that amount of money on the 10th of, I don't know, what's 3 months from now, September, August? I think it's September. Then actually people are more likely to wait for the larger later, because you've given them a more specific amount. So we're trying to find out if thinking more vividly, concretely, you know, with more imagery and more placing yourself in that point in the future makes people more patient, with mixed results. Other things we've looked at is eye tracking. So we have this computer screen that tracks people's eye movements. So, you know, you can have the smaller sooner amount here, the smaller sooner delay here, the larger later amount here, the larger later delay here. So you've got these 4 attributes, and there are theories to say that the conventional theories, the old theories stemming from economics, say that you should look more within the option, you know, you should go, £50 3 months, £50 3 months, that's that value, you put a value to that option. You go £70, well, I said 1 month, sorry, we're changing it to 6 months here now, 3 months, 6 months, £70 6 months, that is that value to me. You create these mental values that you then compare in your mind. So predicts looking more between the options. The more recent theories say that no, you actually make comparisons between the amounts and between the delays. So you go, £50, £70, £50, £70, 3 months, 6 months, 3 months, 6 months, you know? What we found is that people do both. It was nearly 50-50 between the two. Primarily, people seem to look in reading order. Now, this screen is mirrored, so I may be doing it the wrong way. I'm going to try to do it the way you see it. So people go from, this is my right, this is probably your left, from left to right, the reading order, and then they go down, and then they just go back up. That was basically what we found. So, that's my research. We're now looking at some other effects that are related to get more ideas of how the mental processes are involved when we make decisions that involve rewarding things like money over time. So just what I explained to you. I hope I made that sound interesting. It is really dry and gets kind of down to just plain old numbers and, you know, the X and Y coordinates of your eyes on a screen and that kind of thing. But also, you know, it has some really neat implications for pension savings and health and just any way we can plan for the future in a way that means we need to sacrifice for the now. So I'm sure lots of people are thinking, you know, environmental things, if we can maybe forego some things that are very tempting in the here and now, maybe we can save up for the future. That, you know, is the future. It's kind of important. So that is basically my PhD in a nutshell. And the next question, very appropriately. I'll ask the question you're technically not supposed to ask. You're right. How is the PhD going? Been there, done that. See, other PhD students understand. Not this the question earlier, I really appreciate it. I'm curious as to how the process compares over there. Do you have an oral defense along with a written thesis? I was so relieved when I was done mine, but the joy of hearing someone call you doctor is worth it. If you haven't come across it yet, you should check out PhD in Comics. Yes, PhD Comics is great. It is similar. I write a thesis. It's basically a whole book of dry science, and I have to defend it for a couple of hours with an internal and external examiner, so someone from university and someone from outside university. And my supervisor will be there, and maybe also my secondary supervisor, though I haven't seen her for a long time. She knits though, that's pretty cool. So that is how it works. I am technically in write-up, which means my researching is done and I'm just writing, and I haven't written a word because I'm actually not done researching. But I had to transfer because money. I am now going to try to rely on my pattern revenue and just do that, and that means if I go into write-up, my fees are lower, and because I'm so close to being in write-up, it didn't make sense to pay for a whole term of doing research when really all we have left is to run some very quick online studies. So that is what we're gonna do, and then I'm just gonna write, and we hope I'm done within the year, but I don't know about that personally because there is a lot of stuff happening. So I'm not saying anything for certain, but I am very relieved to have this whole Skeindeer thing happening because it means I'm not as reliant on research grant as my colleagues. So I'm not like writing until it runs out and I'm gonna have to live on the streets if I don't finish sooner, you know. I'm quite fortunate there. So that's how that's going. I'm not in a good mental place to do it, which is usually, you know, why we PhD students know not to ask, because it takes a toll. And I have seen PhDs do some very, you know, the PhD degree do some pretty devastating things to the poor students that are trying to finish, and some don't, and some become quite messed up for life because it's a really hard thing to do. It is a very tough task. You are so reliant on yourself, your time management, your intellect, and you start doubting yourself and everything you spent the past 3-4 years on, and go into a very dark hole. And I don't know what I would be doing if I didn't have knitting and you guys. So yeah, wish me luck.